At 72, I thought I knew what betrayal felt like. I was wrong. The phone's blue glow cut through my bedroom darkness like a knife. 5:17 in the morning, and my bank was sending me alerts faster than my tired eyes could read them. Transfer complete $75,000. Transfer complete $50,000. Transfer complete $25,000. 8 minutes. That's all it took to drain my life savings of $225,000 while I slept in my own bed. My hands trembled as I scrolled through message after message, each one stealing another piece of my future. The cottage cheese I'd eaten for dinner the night before turned to acid in my stomach. The flannel sheets that had wrapped me in comfort for 30 years now felt like a shroud. But it wasn't the money that made my chest tighten until I could barely breathe. It was the taste still lingering on my tongue. Sweet honey, fresh mint. The lemon water Derek had insisted I drink before bed. His smile warm as summer as he pressed the glass into my hands. My son, my only son. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I stumbled to the kitchen, muscle memory guiding me through the dark hallway. Everything looked the same. The ceramic rooster on the windowsill, the stack of mail by the coffee maker, the dish towel folded just so on the counter. Normal, peaceful, a lie. I flicked on the overhead light, squinting against the harsh fluorescent glare. There by the sink sat 2 glasses. Mine lipstick traces still visible on the rim. His barely touched the contents dumped and rinsed clean. Evidence of his deception hiding in plain sight. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the dinner we'd shared. Roasted chicken with rosemary from my garden. Green beans snapped fresh that morning. Derek had complimented everything, told me I still cooked better than any restaurant in town. His words felt different now, layered with calculation I'd been too trusting to hear. I pulled out my phone again each swipe, revealing another devastating detail. All transactions authorized from my device. All passwords correctly entered. The bank's security system showed no breach, no hacking, no theft by strangers. This was an inside job executed by someone who knew exactly where I kept my login information, exactly how I moved money, exactly how to make me sleep deeply enough to steal everything I had. My legs gave out. I grabbed the edge of the kitchen table, the same oak surface where Derek had sat just hours ago, animated and eager as he described his latest business venture. Another startup, another sure thing, another chance to finally make his mark on the world. I'd listened with the patient smile of a mother who'd heard similar promises for 40 years. The irony wasn't lost on me. While he painted pictures of future success, he was already planning to fund it with my retirement. I thought about calling the police. I thought about calling Derek. I thought about calling my sister in Phoenix, the one who'd warned me years ago that I gave him too much rope. Instead, I made coffee with shaking hands and tried to piece together exactly how my own child had drugged and robbed me in my sleep. The evidence was there if I was willing to see it. The unusual drowsiness that had crept over me as we talked. The way Derek had lingered, offering to lock up, insisting I didn't need to wait up for him. The soft footsteps I'd heard in the hallway. The faint glow under my office door. The whisper of my desk drawer sliding open. I'd told myself it was nothing. I'd wanted to believe it was nothing. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't the bank. It was a text from Derek sent at 4:47 a.m. Thanks for dinner, Mom. Got called away on business. We'll check in soon. Called away on business. At 4 in the morning, right after cleaning out my accounts. I stared at those words until they blurred together, my coffee growing cold in my hands. The man who used to bring me dandelions from the yard when he was 5. The boy who'd cried in my arms after his first heartbreak. The son I'd bailed out of financial trouble more times than I could count. He'd finally found a solution to his money problems. He'd stolen mine. The morning sun began filtering through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. Somewhere in the distance, Mrs. Patterson was starting her car for the early shift at the hospital. The garbage truck rumbled down Maple Street. The world was waking up to Tuesday, like any other Tuesday. But my Tuesday had started with the discovery that the person I trusted most had betrayed me in the cruelest way possible. And as I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the remnants of a life I thought was secure, I realized this was just the beginning. Derek had made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated his mother. I might be 72, but I wasn't helpless. I wasn't weak. And I sure as hell wasn't going to let him get away with this. The fight was just starting. The Riverside Community Bank sat on the corner of Main and 4th, like a fortress of red brick and brass fixtures. I'd been banking there for 37 years through mortgage payments and college tuition, and every small triumph that required a safe place to keep money. Now I was walking through those familiar glass doors as a victim carrying a manila folder thick with printed statements and a story that made my throat tight every time I tried to tell it. The carpet still smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. The teller windows gleamed under fluorescent lights that had been humming the same tune since 1987. Everything looked exactly as it should, which made the violation feel even sharper. This was my safe place, and somehow Derek had turned it into a crime scene. Margaret Chen, the branch manager, met me at the security desk. I'd known her since she was a trainee with nervous hands and an eager smile. Now she had silver threading through her black hair and the confident bearing of someone who'd seen every kind of financial emergency. But when I explained why I was there, her professional composure cracked just enough to let genuine concern show through. "Mrs. Harrison," she said, leading me to her office. "I've already flagged your accounts for investigation, but I have to ask, are you absolutely certain these weren't authorized transactions?" I spread the bank statements across her desk like evidence in a courtroom. "Margaret, I've been managing my own money since before your youngest was born. Does this look like something I would do?" She studied the timestamps, the amounts, the rapid-fire sequence of transfers. Her frown deepened with each page. "The system shows these came from your registered devices. Your phone, your laptop. The security protocols were all properly authenticated, which means someone had physical access to both. Someone who knew your passwords. Someone I trusted." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. Margaret had been in banking long enough to recognize the shape of family betrayal. She'd seen grown children drain elderly parents' accounts, spouses hide assets before divorce, business partners disappear with everything they could carry. But knowing the pattern didn't make it easier to witness. "There's something else," Margaret said, pulling a folder from her desk drawer. "After you called yesterday, I ran a deeper analysis of your account activity. These large transfers weren't the beginning. They were the finale." She handed me a printout that made my stomach drop. Small withdrawals going back 3 months. $50 here, 100 there, always timed to coincide with Derek's visits. Always just small enough to slip past my casual attention, mixed in with legitimate expenses like grocery bills and pharmacy copays. "He's been testing the waters," I whispered, tracing the dates with my finger. Learning my patterns. Building up to this. Mrs. Harrison, I think you should know. We're not the only bank he's been visiting. My head snapped up. What do you mean? Margaret's expression grew carefully neutral, the way it does when a banker is about to share information they probably shouldn't. I have a colleague at First National. Yesterday she mentioned a suspicious inquiry about an elderly customer's account access. The description of the individual matched someone I'd seen here recently. Derek had been shopping around, testing multiple banks, multiple vulnerabilities. This wasn't desperate impulse. It was calculated fraud, planned and executed with the kind of thoroughness that suggested experience. There's more, Margaret continued. The IP address logs show your accounts were accessed from locations you've never visited. Coffee shops on the east side, a public library downtown. Someone was logging in remotely, probably to monitor your balance and transaction history. She pulled up a map on her computer screen, red dots marking each unauthorized access point. The pattern looked almost like surveillance, a methodical study of my financial habits conducted over weeks. Margaret, I need you to freeze everything. Every account, every card, every automatic payment. I don't care if my lights get shut off. I want nothing moving without my physical presence and 2 forms of ID. Already done, she said. As of 1 hour ago, your accounts are locked tighter than Fort Knox. I should have felt relief, but instead a new kind of dread settled in my chest. If Derek had been this systematic, this patient, then the money was probably already gone. Moved through accounts I didn't know about, converted to assets I couldn't trace, scattered in ways that would make recovery nearly impossible. There's someone I think you should talk to, Margaret said, reaching for her phone. Detective Sarah Walsh with the Financial Crimes Unit. She specializes in elder fraud, and Mrs. Harrison. She's very good at what she does. While Margaret made the call, I stared out her office window at the parking lot where I'd parked my sedan in the same spot I always used. Routine, predictability, all the things that had made me feel secure had also made me vulnerable. Derek had studied my habits like a predator studies prey, and I'd never noticed because I trusted him completely. My phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. We need to talk. Coffee shop on Elm Street. 1 hour, come alone. I showed the screen to Margaret, who was just hanging up with the detective. Her eyes widened. Mrs. Harrison, don't respond to that. Don't go anywhere alone. This is escalating. But I was already standing, already gathering my papers. Something in that message felt different. Not threatening exactly. Urgent. Like someone else had pieces of this puzzle I needed to see. Margaret, tell Detective Walsh I'll meet with her tomorrow. But first, I'm going to find out who's been watching Derek watch me. The coffee shop on Elm Street was the kind of place that served fair trade everything and played jazz so quiet you had to strain to hear it. I'd never been inside before, but somehow I knew exactly where to go. The woman in the corner booth, laptop open eyes, scanning the room with professional alertness. She was younger than I expected, maybe 45, with steel grey hair and the kind of lean build that suggested regular exercise and careful eating. When she saw me approach, she closed the laptop and gestured to the seat across from her. Mrs. Harrison, thank you for coming. My name is Linda Reyes. I'm a private investigator. Who hired you? Derek's previous victim. The words hit me like cold water. Previous victim. There had been others. Linda slid a photograph across the table. An elderly man, maybe 75, standing beside a classic Buick in front of a small house. He looked happy, prosperous, unaware that his life was about to change. Harold Martinez. Derek befriended him 8 months ago at a senior center in Sacramento. Same pattern. Gradual financial access, slow withdrawal of small amounts, then a final devastating theft. Harold lost his house. My coffee cup rattled against the saucer as I set it down. How many others? That I can prove 3. That I suspect probably twice that number. Derek has been working this con for at least 2 years, moving from city to city, targeting elderly people who live alone and have substantial savings. She opened a manila folder thick with documents. Bank statements, photographs, police reports. A paper trail of systematic elder abuse that made my stolen retirement look like a single verse in a much longer, darker song. Harold hired me after the police closed his case. Insufficient evidence, they said. Derek had covered his tracks too well. But Harold knew his grandson was innocent, and he wanted someone to prove it. His grandson, Derek convinced Harold that his own grandson was stealing from him. Created fake evidence, manipulated the old man's medications to cause confusion and memory problems. By the time Harold realized what was happening, Derek had taken everything and disappeared. I stared at the photographs, the documented evidence of a predator who specialized in destroying families from the inside. Derek hadn't just stolen my money. He was a professional criminal who targeted the most vulnerable people in society, using their trust and love against them. Mrs. Harrison, your son, isn't just a desperate man making bad choices. He's a sociopath who's perfected the art of elder abuse. And he's very, very good at it. The jazz music seemed to fade into silence. The afternoon light streaming through the coffee shop windows felt cold and harsh. Everything I thought I knew about my son, about my situation, about my own judgment, crumbled and reformed into something much more frightening. "What do you need from me?" I asked. Linda smiled for the first time since I'd sat down. "I need you to help me catch him, because this time he picked the wrong mother." Linda's coffee shop revelation should have terrified me. Learning that my son was a serial predator, that I was just another mark in a long line of elderly victims, should have left me shattered and helpless. Instead, something unexpected happened as I drove home through the familiar streets of my neighborhood. I felt relieved. For the first time in months, everything made sense. Derek's sudden attentiveness, his carefully timed visits, the way he'd probed for information about my routines, my finances, my vulnerabilities. It wasn't the desperate act of a struggling son. It was the methodical approach of a professional criminal. And professionals, I realize, always underestimate amateurs who've had time to think. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment, studying my house with new eyes. The yellow cottage, with its white trim and wraparound porch, looked exactly as it had for 20 years. But appearances, as I was learning, could be deeply deceiving. Inside, I went straight to my bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of my dresser. Underneath the winter sweaters and old photo albums was a small digital recorder I'd purchased 3 months ago. The same week Derek had started his random visits to check on his dear old mother. My finger found the playback button. Derek's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable, from our dinner conversation just 2 nights ago. "Mom, you really should consider setting up automatic transfers for your bills. I could help you with that. Make everything simpler. The bank said you could add me as a secondary account holder just for emergencies." in case something happens to you. Have you thought about what you want to do with all this equity? A reverse mortgage might make sense at your age. Every suggestion designed to give him access. Every offer wrapped in concern for my well-being. I'd recorded 6 hours of similar conversations over the past 3 months, each one building a case I hadn't been sure I'd ever need to use. Turns out my instincts were better than my trust. The phone rang. Derek's number flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then played the message back immediately. "Hi, Mom, it's me. I'm out of town on business for a few days, but I wanted to check on you. Call me back when you get this. Love you." Business? Right. Probably moving my money through whatever network he'd established for laundering his thefts. But his casual tone told me something important. He didn't know I'd discovered the missing funds yet. He thought I was still the confused, trusting victim who would take days to notice such a large financial discrepancy. That gave me a window. A small one, but enough to work with. I called Linda back. She answered on the first ring. "Mrs. Harrison, I was hoping you'd... I need to know everything about Derek's operation. Bank accounts, associates, travel patterns, everything. And I need to know it fast. Are you sure you want to get this involved? Mrs. Harrison, this could be dangerous." "Linda, I've been recording his conversations for 3 months. I've documented every suspicious interaction, every time he pushed for financial access, every lie he told about his concern for my welfare. I didn't just stumble into this situation. I've been preparing for it." Silence on the other end of the line. Then slowly, "You knew." "I suspected. My son has been a talented liar since he was 7 years old and blamed the neighbor's cat for breaking my grandmother's vase. But this was different. Too polished. Too professional." "What do you need from me?" "I need you to help me flip the script. Derek thinks he's the hunter. Time to show him what it feels like to be prey." By evening, Linda was at my kitchen table with her laptop open and files spread across the surface like a war room briefing. What she'd uncovered in just 6 months of investigation was staggering. Derek had at least 7 different identities. Bank accounts in 4 states. A network of accomplices who specialized in document forgery, identity theft, and money laundering. His operation was sophisticated enough to have evaded law enforcement across multiple jurisdictions. The problem, Linda explained, is that he's always one step ahead of the paper trail. By the time victims realize what's happened, the money is gone and Derek has disappeared. But this time he made a mistake. I said, pulling out my own folder. He stayed local. He's gotten comfortable, probably because I seemed like such an easy mark. And comfortable criminals get sloppy. I showed her the documents I'd been quietly assembling. Photographs of Derek's car at various banks around the county. Printouts of his social media activity, showing him at high-end restaurants and shopping centers. Credit card statements I'd obtained through a private investigator I'd hired months ago. "Mrs. Harrison, how long have you been planning this?" Since the first time he asked about my financial planning. Derek always was too eager when money was involved. It reminded me of how he used to hover around the cookie jar as a child, trying to look innocent while plotting his approach. Linda leaned back in her chair, studying me with new respect. "You've been setting him up." "I've been protecting myself. There's a difference." She laughed, a short bark of appreciation. "Not much of one in this case. We worked until midnight, cross-referencing Derek's known aliases with recent bank activity. Mapping his movement patterns, identifying the specific accounts where my money had likely been transferred. Linda had contacts in law enforcement who could freeze assets if we could provide enough evidence. but we needed to move fast. Derek will realize something's wrong when he tries to access the funds, Linda warned. Once that happens, he'll disappear. New identity, new location, new hunting ground. No, I said, closing my laptop with quiet finality. This time he's not running anywhere. The next morning I was waiting in the parking lot of First National Bank when Derek's silver BMW pulled up to the ATM. I watched through my rearview mirror as he inserted a card typed in a PIN and waited for the transaction to process. His body language changed in an instant, shoulders tensing, head jerking forward to read the screen more carefully. He tried the transaction again, then again. On the fourth attempt, he pulled out his phone and made a call, his voice carrying across the parking lot with increasing agitation. I started my engine and followed him as he drove to 2 more banks. Same routine, same growing frustration. By the 3rd bank, he was pacing beside his car phone, pressed to his ear, gesturing wildly at no one. My phone buzzed with a text. Mom, having some technical difficulties with my accounts. Can I borrow some cash? Just until I get this sorted out. I typed back, of course, dear. How much do you need? Maybe 5,000. I know it's a lot, but no problem. Come by the house this evening and we'll figure it out. 3 dots appeared and disappeared several times before his response came through, thanks, Mom. You're a lifesaver. That evening, I set the table for 2 and made Derek's favorite meal pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the same recipe I'd used when he was 10 years old, and thought I could solve any problem with comfort food. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was preparing his last supper. Linda's van was parked 2 blocks away, recording equipment ready. Detective Walsh was positioned across the street in an unmarked car. The recorder in my sweater pocket was fully charged. Everything was in place for Derek to hang himself with his own words. He arrived at 7 sharp, his usual charm, dialed up to maximum wattage. Flowers in one hand, a bottle of wine in the other. That winning smile that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life. Mom, you look wonderful. I hope I'm not putting you to too much trouble. Never, sweetheart. You know I love cooking for you. We ate dinner like a normal family. Derek complimented the seasoning, asked about my garden, shared amusing stories about his travels. Anyone watching would see a devoted son visiting his elderly mother. They wouldn't see the predator calculating exactly how much he could extract from his latest victim. After dinner, as I served coffee and homemade pie, Derek shifted into his familiar routine. Mom, I want to talk to you about something important. About your financial security. Oh, I've been thinking about what we discussed before. About making sure you're protected if something happens. Setting up some automatic systems, maybe adding me to your accounts as a backup. I poured cream into my coffee, my hand steady, despite my racing heart. That's very thoughtful of you, Derek. The thing is, I'm worried about you managing all these accounts on your own. It's a lot of responsibility for someone your age. Someone my age. As if 72 meant senile. You know what I think would be smart. He continued, leaning forward with practiced sincerity. If we move some of your money into a joint account, something we could both access, for your peace of mind. There it was. The same pitch he'd probably used on Harold Martinez and the others. Create urgency, offer security, gain, access, drain everything. I reached into my sweater pocket and placed the recorder on the table between us. Derek's face went white, his eyes fixed on the small black device like it was a loaded gun pointed at his chest. Hello, son, I said quietly. We need to talk. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Derek stared at the recorder as if it might explode, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth, a piece of potato sliding off and landing on his plate with a soft plop. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked each second with mechanical precision, and I could hear his breathing change from normal to shallow, to something that sounded almost like panting. "What is that?" he asked, though we both knew exactly what it was. "Your confession," I said, cutting another bite of pot roast with deliberate care. 3 months' worth of conversations where you systematically probed for access to my financial accounts. "Would you like to hear your greatest hits?" I pressed play. Derek's voice filled the dining room, smooth and concerned. "Mom, have you thought about what would happen if you had a medical emergency? Who would handle your bills, your investments?" His face drained of color. "Mom, I was just—" I held up a hand and let the recording continue. "It would be so much easier if I could help you manage things. Maybe we should look at power of attorney arrangements." "You don't understand," Derek said, standing abruptly. His chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "This isn't what it sounds like. Sit down." My voice carried an authority I hadn't used since he was 15 and came home drunk. "We're not finished." He sat. Something in my tone, perhaps, or the way I hadn't moved from my chair, hadn't even looked particularly surprised by his reaction. The predator in him was beginning to recognize that the dynamics in the room weren't what he'd expected. I reached into the cabinet behind me and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "Linda Reyes sends her regards, by the way. She's very interested in discussing Harold Martinez with you. And Patricia Chen. And Robert Williams." Derek's hands started to shake. "Who the hell is Linda Reyes?" "The private investigator Harold Martinez hired after you stole his house." I opened the folder and spread the photographs across the table. "She's been tracking you for 8 months, Derek, building a case, documenting your victims." His eyes darted to the photos, then to the windows, then to the front door. I could see him calculating distances, escape routes, options that were shrinking by the second. "This is insane, Mom. You're talking about me like I'm some kind of criminal." "You are a criminal." I said it simply, like noting the weather. "You've been stealing from elderly people for years, perfecting your technique, getting better at reading vulnerabilities, exploiting trust, disappearing before anyone could connect the dots." "I never—" "You drugged me Tuesday night." My voice remained steady, conversational. "Slipped something into that lemon water you insisted I drink. Something to make me sleep deeply while you accessed my computer and transferred my life savings to accounts I don't even know about." Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "That's ridiculous. I would never—" "The toxicology report says otherwise." I pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of Mercy General Hospital. "Blood work doesn't lie. Derek. Zolpidem. Ambien. Enough to keep an elephant unconscious for 6 hours. You had blood work done Wednesday morning, right after I discovered my accounts had been drained." I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. "Did you really think I was stupid enough to believe I'd authorized $250,000 transfers in my sleep?" The change in Derek was visible, like watching a mask slip off to reveal something uglier underneath. The concerned sun disappeared, replaced by cold calculation. His posture shifted, shoulders squaring, jaw tightening. When he spoke again, his voice carried none of its earlier warmth. "Prove it. Already have." I gestured toward the window. Detective Walsh has been recording this conversation from across the street. Linda's van has been monitoring your phone calls all day. Every bank you visited, every account you tried to access, every desperate attempt to move money before the authorities froze your assets. Derek spun toward the window, then back to me. You set me up. I protected myself. There's a difference. This is entrapment. This is justice. He stood again, this time, with the coiled energy of someone preparing to bolt. You can't prove anything. Even if I did borrow some money. Borrow. The word came out sharper than I'd intended. Is that what you called it when you stole Harold Martinez's house? When you convinced Patricia Chen her own daughter was embezzling from her? When you left Robert Williams homeless in his 80s? Derek's face twisted into something I'd never seen before. Raw anger stripped of pretense. Those people were dying anyway, sitting on money they'd never live long enough to spend. I gave their last years purpose. The honesty was more chilling than any lie he could have told. This wasn't desperation or addiction or some tragic character flaw. This was deliberate, systematic exploitation dressed up as philosophy. Purpose, I repeated. By destroying their families. By making them question their own children's loyalty. By teaching them that trust is a luxury they couldn't afford. Derek moved toward the door, his voice rising. You want to know the truth, Mom. You were also pathetically grateful for attention. Harold lit up every time I visited. Patricia cried when I brought her flowers. They were lonely, and I gave them company. The money was just payment for services rendered. What about me, Derek? Was I pathetically grateful too? He paused at the doorway, his hand on the frame. When he turned back, his expression held something that might have been genuine emotion. Regret, perhaps. Or just irritation at a job left unfinished. You were different, he said quietly. Sharper. More careful. I actually had to work for it. But you did it anyway. I needed the money. For what? He laughed, a bitter sound that made my chest tighten. Does it matter? Another investment opportunity? Another sure thing? Another chance to finally become the man you always wanted me to be? I never wanted you to become a thief. No, you wanted me to become successful, rich, respected, someone you could be proud of. His voice cracked slightly. Well, congratulations, Mom. I got very good at taking what I needed. The admission hung in the air between us like smoke. 47 years of birthdays and Christmas mornings and proud moments at school plays reduced to this, a son who'd learned to monetize his mother's love. Derek, I said softly, when did you stop seeing me as your mother and start seeing me as a mark? He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. The day I realized you had more money than I'd ever make, honestly. Car doors slammed outside. Heavy footsteps on the front porch. Derek's time was up, and we both knew it. Our last chance, Mom. He said, his hand moving toward his jacket pocket. Call them off. Tell them this was a misunderstanding. We can work something out, just the two of us. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. Someone who would threaten his own mother rather than face the consequences of his choices. No, I said, we can't. The front door burst open. Detective Walsh entered first, followed by two uniformed officers. Derek raised his hands, slowly the fight going out of him as suddenly as it had appeared. Derek Harrison. Detective Walsh announced, You're under arrest for elder abuse, financial exploitation, and fraud. As they cuffed him, Derek looked back at me one last time. I hope it was worth it, Mom. Destroying your only family. You destroyed this family the first time you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive. They led him away, and suddenly the house was quiet again. Linda appeared from somewhere, checking to make sure I was all right. Detective Walsh asked if I needed medical attention, emotional support, anything at all. I told them I was fine, which was mostly true. But as I sat alone in my dining room, surrounded by the remnants of what might have been our last family dinner, I felt the weight of what I'd just done. I'd caught him, stopped him, protected other potential victims from experiencing what Harold Martinez and the others had endured. But I'd also lost my son. Not to death or distance, or the ordinary drift of families, but to handcuffs and courtrooms and prison cells. The victory felt exactly as hollow as I'd expected it would. 3 weeks after Derek's arrest, I found the letter. It was wedged behind my bedroom dresser, probably knocked back there during one of his late-night searches through my personal belongings. The envelope was addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize, postmarked 6 months ago. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph that made my blood turn to ice water. The photograph showed Derek at age 16 standing beside a woman I'd never seen before. They were both smiling, his arm around her shoulders in a gesture that looked comfortable, familiar, practiced. The letter was from Patricia Chen's daughter, the one Derek had convinced Patricia was stealing from her. Mrs. Harrison, it began. If you're reading this, it means my mother is dead and Derek has moved on to his next victim. I'm writing to warn you that everything you think you know about your son is wrong. My hands shook as I read the rest. Patricia Chen hadn't been Derek's victim. She'd been his partner. They'd met at a senior center in San Diego, where Patricia was volunteering, and Derek was supposedly visiting his grandmother. Patricia had lost her husband the year before and was struggling financially despite the insurance payout. Derek offered her a solution: they would target wealthy elderly people together. Patricia would gain their trust as a fellow senior, while Derek played the concerned younger relative. The con had worked perfectly, until Patricia started keeping too much of the money for herself. Derek eliminated the partnership the only way he knew how, by making Patricia the victim instead of the accomplice. My mother called me the night before she died. The letter continued. She said Derek had figured out she was skimming from their accounts. She was terrified. The next morning she was found dead from an apparent medication overdose. The police ruled it suicide, but I knew better. I sat on my bedroom floor surrounded by 30 years of photo albums and memory boxes, reading about my son's evolution from theft to murder. Patricia Chen hadn't killed herself. She'd been eliminated by a partner who'd outgrown the need for help. The phone rang. Detective Walsh's voice was carefully controlled. Mrs. Harrison, we need to talk. Can you come down to the station? An hour later, I sat in the same conference room where I'd given my initial statement, watching Detective Walsh spread crime scene photos across the table. Patricia Chen, Harold Martinez, Robert Williams. All three had died within weeks of their money disappearing. We've been working with jurisdictions in 4 states, Detective Walsh explained. Once we had Derek's pattern, we could trace him backward. The elderly people he targeted didn't just lose their money, Mrs. Harrison. Eventually, they lost their lives. You think he killed them? I think he discovered that dead victims don't report crimes. The room spun slightly. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to process the magnitude of what I was hearing. Derek wasn't just a thief. He was a serial killer who specialized in making murder look like natural death. How many are, I whispered. We can prove 7 deaths across 3 years. But Mrs. Harrison, we think there are more. A lot more. That night I called Linda Reyes. She arrived within an hour, carrying a box of files I'd never seen before. I didn't want to tell you until we were sure, she said, spreading documents across my kitchen table. But once the police started investigating the deaths, the pattern became clear. She showed me death certificates, obituaries, insurance claims. Derek's victims had all died alone from apparent accidents or medical emergencies. Heart attacks, medication, overdoses, falls downstairs. Deaths that looked natural unless you knew to look for the pattern. He perfected the technique, Linda explained. Gain access to their homes, their routines, their medications. Then create a scenario that looked accidental but guaranteed the outcome he needed. The lemon water, I said suddenly. That night he drugged me. If I hadn't discovered the missing money the next morning. Linda nodded grimly. You would have been found dead in your bed. Apparent heart attack brought on by the stress of discovering your accounts had been hacked by unknown criminals. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Derek hadn't just been planning to steal my money. He'd been planning to kill me. My own son had come to my house that night intending to commit murder. I thought about the way he'd hugged me goodbye, the tenderness in his voice when he'd said he'd lock up on his way out. The performance had been flawless because he'd been saying goodbye forever. Mrs. Harrison, Linda said gently, there's something else. Something the police don't know yet. She pulled out a thick folder labeled with Derek's name. I've been investigating him for longer than I told you. This case didn't start with Harold Martinez. The folder contained photographs, documents, and news clippings going back 15 years. Different names, different cities, but the same pattern. Derek had been perfecting his techniques since his 20s, learning to identify vulnerable targets, refining his approach, increasing his success rate. He's not a desperate man who turned to crime, Linda said. He's a career criminal who discovered that elderly people make perfect victims. Isolated, trusting, and unlikely to be missed quickly when they disappear. I stared at the evidence of my son's true nature, trying to reconcile it with the boy I'd raised, the man I'd loved despite his flaws. But the truth was inescapable. Derek had never been desperate or struggling or temporarily misguided. He'd been a predator from the beginning, and I'd been too blind to see it. Linda, I said slowly, how did you really get involved in this case? Her expression changed, becoming more guarded. I told you. Harold Martinez hired me, but you've been investigating Derek for 15 years. Harold only hired you 8 months ago. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photographs spread across my table. When she looked up, her eyes held a pain that made everything else make sense. Derek killed my mother 12 years ago in Phoenix. Made it look like she'd fallen down the stairs while carrying laundry. I was a patrol officer then, just starting out. I couldn't prove it, but I knew. I've been tracking him ever since. The room went silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. Linda had spent more than a decade hunting the man who'd murdered her mother, and I had unknowingly helped her find him. Why didn't you tell me? Because I needed you to make the choice to stop him. If you'd known he was a killer, you might have been too frightened to help, or too conflicted because he was your son. And now, Now he's in custody facing charges in 7 states. The evidence is overwhelming. There won't be any more victims. I thought about Harold Martinez, about Patricia Chen, about all the families Derek had destroyed in pursuit of money he'd spent on luxuries that meant nothing to him. I thought about the mothers and fathers and children left behind, wondering what they'd done wrong, why their loved ones had chosen to die. What happens to them? I asked. The families of his victims. Do they ever get the truth? That depends on you. Linda pulled out a business card for a documentary filmmaker in Los Angeles. She specializes in true crime, stories that focus on victims rather than perpetrators. She wants to tell the story of Derek's victims to give their families closure. But she needs someone to explain how he operated, how he chose his targets, how he gained their trust. You want me to participate in a documentary about my son, the serial killer. I want you to help prevent this from happening to other families. 2 months later, I stood in my living room watching a film crew set up lights and cameras in the same space where Derek had drugged me and planned my murder. The irony wasn't lost on me that the room where he'd expected to find my body was now being used to expose his crimes to the world. The documentary aired 6 months after Derek's conviction. The Trusted Son: How Elder Abuse Became Murder won 3 Emmy Awards and sparked a national conversation about protecting vulnerable elderly people from financial exploitation. More importantly, it led to the identification of 12 additional victims and the recovery of over $2 million in stolen assets. Families who'd spent years wondering why their loved ones had died alone finally got answers. Children who had been accused of elder abuse were exonerated. Insurance companies that had denied claims based on suspicious deaths reopened their investigations. The ripple effects continued for years. New laws were passed requiring closer monitoring of elderly people's financial accounts. Training programs were developed to help bank employees recognize signs of financial abuse. Support groups were established for families affected by elder exploitation. Derek died in prison, 3 years into his sentence, killed by an inmate whose grandfather had been murdered by a different elder abuse criminal. The irony was bitter, but somehow fitting. He'd spent his life preying on the defenseless, only to be killed by someone defending the defenseless. I didn't attend his funeral. I wasn't sure there was one. Today, 5 years later, I sit in my garden watching my neighbor's granddaughter play in the sprinkler next door. She's 7, the same age Derek was when he started lying about breaking things and blaming others. The same age when I first noticed his ability to manipulate situations to his advantage. I wonder sometimes if I could have changed things. If I'd been less trusting, more suspicious, quicker to set boundaries. If I'd recognized the signs earlier, demanded accountability, sooner loved him less blindly. But I've come to understand that some people are born broken in ways that can't be fixed by good parenting or unconditional love. Derek made his choices. Every victim he selected, every trust he violated, every life he ended, was a deliberate decision made by someone who understood right from wrong, but simply didn't care about the difference. The hardest part isn't the guilt anymore. It's the relief. I sleep soundly now, knowing that the most dangerous person in my life is gone forever. I manage my own finances, make my own decisions, trust my own instincts. I've learned that loving someone doesn't mean enabling them, and that family loyalty has limits that shouldn't be crossed. The documentary made me something of an accidental expert on elder abuse prevention. I speak at senior centers and community groups, sharing Derek's story as a warning about the signs families should watch for. The hardest question I get asked is always the same. How do you live with the knowledge that your own child was a monster? The answer is that monsters aren't born wearing signs. They look like everyone else, speak like everyone else, love like everyone else when it serves their purposes. Derek wasn't evil from birth. He became evil through a series of choices that led him further and further from the person I'd hoped he would become. But here's what I've learned that might save someone else's life when people show you who they are, believe them. When your instincts tell you something is wrong, listen. When someone you love starts treating you like a resource instead of a person, protect yourself first and worry about their feelings later. Love shouldn't require you to sacrifice your safety, your sanity, or your savings account. And if it does, it isn't really love at all. The little girl next door shrieks with laughter as the sprinkler catches her again. Her grandmother watches from the porch, smiling at the simple joy of a child at play. It's a scene I've witnessed thousands of times in thousands of yards, but now I see it differently. I see the trust between generations that should be protected at all costs. I see the vulnerability that predators like Derek counted on finding. And I see the fierce love that drives people like Linda Reyes to spend decades hunting the monsters who destroy families from within. My story became part of something larger than my own pain. Derek's victims got justice. Their families got answers. New laws protect other elderly people from suffering the same fate. That's not redemption for what Derek did. Nothing could redeem that. But it's purpose found in the ruins of what my family became. And sometimes purpose is enough. The truth is, some stories don't have happy endings. They have necessary ones. This was mine.